Everyone walked past the trembling foal, until one man realized what the government had been hiding inside him. At a forgotten auction in rural Wyoming, a frail young foal stood shaking as every rancher turned away, unaware that his trembling wasn't weakness, but a signal of something far more dangerous. And when one quiet man stepped toward him, he uncovered a truth powerful enough to upend both of their lives forever. The cold breath of late autumn drifted across the Wyoming plains, rolling in thin waves over the rust-colored grass and settling softly against the old Cedar Brook auction barn. Morning light, pale, exhausted, filtered through the slats in the worn wooden walls, catching dust in the air and turning it into drifting specks of gold. The barn buzzed with the low murmur of ranchers who had seen too many auctions, too many animals, too many losses. Their boots scuffed the dirt with a rhythm that reminded Elliot Monroe of wind scraping against burnt trees. He stood near the far railing, shoulders slightly hunched beneath his faded canvas jacket, as though the cold wasn't around him, but inside him, etched into the place where warmth used to live. Elliot didn't come here to buy. He barely came here to talk. Most days he came simply because watching life move, even in a place as worn as this, kept the silence of his own home from swallowing him whole. The barn felt familiar, predictable, almost safe in its rugged, indifferent way. And Elliot needed predictable. After years fighting wildfires and one terrible night that reshaped him forever, predictability was the closest thing he had to peace. The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice echoing off metal rails. "Next one up," he announced with a half-hearted enthusiasm that fooled no one. A handler stepped into the ring, tugging gently on a thin rope. The foal that emerged looked as if the wind might carry him away. His coat, an ashy silver washed with pale undertones, clung to narrow ribs, and his legs trembled, as though each step cost him more than he could afford. A hush fell over the nearest group of ranchers before shifting into amused murmurs. "Poor little thing won't make it through winter," someone muttered. "Looks like a ghost horse," another chuckled, shaking his head. "Not worth the hay." Elliot had heard those tones before, the tones men used to distance themselves from vulnerability. But something in the foal's unsteady posture made him look up fully for the first time that morning. The handler tried to guide him toward the center, but the foal shrank away from every noise, especially the metallic clink of the gate chains. His ears snapped back, and he shivered so sharply his thin mane rustled like frightened grass. The auctioneer sighed into the microphone. "All right, folks, lot 19, yearling colt, needs a little TLC." Laughter rose again, light, dismissive, the way people laugh when they don't want to feel pity. Elliot stayed still. He didn't understand the sudden pressure in his chest, the faint tremor that went through him like a memory half remembered. But when the foal lifted his head, when those strange, smoky gray eyes swept across the barn and landed on Elliot, something old inside him stirred, something he thought he'd buried beneath years of regret and wildfire smoke. For a long breath, the world grew quiet. Dust suspended in the air seemed to pause. The foal didn't blink, didn't flinch. He simply looked, not with fear, but with a kind of wounded recognition, as though he knew the shape of Elliot's loss. As though he too had lived through something he could not escape. A man standing nearby snorted. "That thing's a lost cause." But Elliot barely heard him. He took one small step forward, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for the foal's trembling to ease just slightly. The rope slackened. The foal leaned forward, thin legs wobbling, but he held Elliot's gaze with a fragile steadiness that made the air feel heavier, almost sacred. Something is wrong with him, Elliot thought. And yet something is right too. "Opening bid," the auctioneer called out. "Do I hear 50?" Silence spread across the barn. A few men smirked. One kicked at the dirt, uninterested. Elliot's hands stayed at his sides. Buying a horse wasn't just impractical, it was impossible. His ranch was small, built for quiet living, not new responsibility. He'd spent years avoiding anything that resembled connection, anything that might break the uneasy balance he'd built after the wildfire that had taken his team. But when the foal's legs buckled slightly and he caught himself with a soft, defeated sound, Elliot felt something shift inside him. A quiet truth rising from where he'd hidden it. You can't walk away from this. 30, the auctioneer tried again. Anyone at... Before the man could finish, Elliot raised his hand. The reaction was immediate. Heads turned, eyebrows lifted. A few men exchanged surprised looks. Even the auctioneer paused, as though unsure he'd seen correctly. We have 30 from Mr. Monroe, he announced. The foal stilled, his ears angled toward Elliot, and the trembling eased further, subtle as a breath. From the corner of the barn, a man in a dark coat stepped forward, lean frame, unreadable expression, and lifted his hand as well. Elliot didn't know why the gesture sent a ripple of cold through him. The man's eyes weren't on the foal. They were on Elliot. 40, the man said flatly. Elliot's jaw tightened. He didn't understand why this stranger cared, but he knew, with a clarity that startled him, that he couldn't let the foal go. Not to that man, not to anyone who looked at the colt without seeing the fear or the fragility or the small spark of trust that had flickered for him alone. 50, Elliot said quietly. The man hesitated. His gaze flicked once more to Elliot, then to the foal, and for a brief second something calculating moved beneath his expression, something that didn't belong in a simple livestock auction. He lowered his hand. "Sold," the auctioneer declared. "To Mr. Monroe." The barn fell into a soft mix of murmurs, disbelief, amusement, a few sympathetic shakes of the head. Elliot didn't listen. He stepped toward the gate as the handler unclipped the rope. The foal's knees trembled, but when Elliot approached, the colt leaned forward as if drawn to the warmth of a small, steady light. Elliot took a slow breath. He didn't touch the foal, not yet, but he let the animal sense him, smell him, decide for himself. After a moment, the foal released a sound so faint and fragile that Elliot almost missed it. A soft nicker, a whisper of trust. Elliot's heart tightened, not painfully, but deeply. And as he guided the foal out of the ring, unaware that the man in the dark coat was still watching, Elliot felt the smallest breath of purpose return to him, a feeling he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He didn't know the truth yet. He didn't know what the foal carried, or why someone else wanted him. All he knew was the colt had chosen him. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he had chosen the colt in return. The wind sharpened as Elliot guided the foal toward the loading area behind the auction barn. The world felt strangely quiet, as if the morning itself were holding its breath. Rowan, though Elliot did not yet have a name for him, moved with hesitant steps, each one tapping softly against the dirt like a fragile rhythm that didn't quite trust the ground beneath him. Elliot matched his pace, neither rushing nor coaxing, simply staying close enough for the colt to sense a steady presence. For the first time in a long while, Elliot felt another heartbeat sync with his own, faint but determined. The colt stopped halfway to the trailer and lifted his face toward Elliot. Those pale, smoke-gray eyes reflected the cool Wyoming light, as though catching its edges. They were unlike any eyes Elliot had ever seen on a young horse, too knowing, too aware, too haunted. And in that gaze, Elliot sensed a depth of fear layered over something more subtle, an instinctive hope. It hit him unexpectedly, a quiet ache blooming beneath his ribs. He'd seen that look before. Years ago, in the eyes of a firefighter he'd carried out of a collapsing building. Fear and faith balanced on the same line. It was a memory he'd never been able to outrun. The foal blinked, and the spell broke gently, like a leaf drifting free from a branch. Elliot knelt beside him, close enough to see the delicate tremor in the colt's neck. "You're all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure whom he was reassuring. The gesture steadied the animal more than the words. The foal stepped forward inch by cautious inch until his thin flank brushed Elliot's sleeve. A small, weary lean, just enough to say he had chosen this man, even if he didn't understand why. Behind them, muted voices rose again from the barn doors. Laughter, casual dismissal, shifting boots. But those sounds no longer mattered. The world had narrowed to just two beings finding an unexpected connection in the cold Wyoming morning. As Elliot stood and moved toward the trailer ramp, the colt followed him without the rope, following the shape of his shadow and the consistency of his breath. At the ramp's edge, the colt hesitated. His ears flicked toward a metallic rattle somewhere inside the trailer, and he stiffened, body taut as wire. Elliot took a slow step up the ramp, offering no pressure, no command. He simply stood where the light met the dim interior, a figure of calm for the colt to measure himself against. "Easy now," Elliot said softly. "Nothing in there's gonna hurt you." The foal exhaled sharply, the sound fragile as wind brushing a cracked window. But he moved again, one step, then another, until he stood inside the trailer, trembling yet resolute. Elliot felt a quiet relief wash through him, like a tide returning to shore after years of drought. For reasons he didn't dare explore yet, protecting this fragile creature felt more necessary than anything else in his life. As he secured the latch, he felt the faint prickling sensation of being watched. He glanced toward the far edge of the lot. There, partly obscured by the curve of the barn, stood the man in the dark coat who had bid against him. His posture was too still for a casual observer, his gaze too sharp. When their eyes met, the man didn't look away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, offering a gesture that hovered somewhere between acknowledgement and warning. Elliot felt a subtle tension coil at the base of his spine, an instinct honed from years on the fire line. The man stepped back into the shadows, disappearing behind a truck with tinted windows. Elliot swallowed, the cold brushing across his throat like a question he wasn't ready to answer. He climbed into the driver's seat of his old pickup, turned the key, and listened to the familiar rumble of the engine. The truck had carried him through storms, evacuations, fire seasons, and long stretches of lonely travel. Now it carried something else, responsibility, and perhaps the first flicker of meaning he'd allowed himself to feel in years. The kind of meaning that no insurance policy or online security safeguard could quantify. A fragile, living thing trusting him with its life. As Elliot pulled onto the gravel road, he glanced once into the rearview mirror. Through the slats of the trailer, he could just make out the foal's silhouette, small, unsteady, but watching him with the faintest, fragile thread of trust. Elliot tightened his hands around the steering wheel. Whatever had begun inside that auction barn was not over. It felt like the start of a road he hadn't planned to walk, one that might lead somewhere difficult, maybe even dangerous. But as the wind swept across the plains and the mountains stood solemn in the distance, he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't turning back. The colt had chosen him, and Elliot wasn't going to fail him. The sky had shifted to a softer gray by the time Elliot pulled the trailer onto the winding road that cut through Cedar Brook's outskirts. The world beyond his windshield carried the look of a place suspended between seasons. Patches of stubborn green fighting through frost, and the distant Bighorn Range rising like a half-forgotten memory of strength. Despite the engine's steady hum, an uneasy quiet settled inside the cab. Elliot kept glancing at the side mirror, watching for the shape he feared he might see, the dark-coated man's truck. But the road behind him stayed empty, save for the thin dust trail swirling up from the tires. He exhaled slowly, though the tension didn't quite leave his shoulders. The Colt's soft bumps echoed from the trailer, shifting weight, adjusting footing, finding balance in this strange new world. Each subtle thud felt like a fragile heartbeat trying to steady itself. As the road narrowed near a line of cottonwoods, Elliot slowed. His ranch wasn't far now, an old piece of land tucked between rolling hills where the wind seldom stopped moving. He'd rebuilt the barn himself, board by board, after the wildfire season that had ended his career and fractured his world. It wasn't much, but it was home. Quiet, predictable, a place where nothing unexpected ever crossed the fence line, until today. When he finally turned into the gravel drive, a cloud of fine dust lifted behind him, scattering in the cold air. The familiar creak of the cattle gate greeted him like an old friend as he stepped out of the truck. For a moment, Elliot allowed himself a breath, small, steadying, before moving to the trailer. The Colt stood near the front, ears flicked forward, legs braced just enough to stay upright. His eyes met Elliot's through the slats, and the recognition in them, shy, uncertain, yet present, pulled at something deeper than loneliness. "Easy," Elliot murmured as he unlatched the door. "You're all right now." The foal hesitated at the lip of the trailer ramp, nose raised to take in the mingled scents of earth, hay, and crisp mountain air. But unlike at the auction barn, there was no metallic clatter, no sharp laughter, no crowd pressing judgment onto his trembling frame. There was only the whisper of wind pushing gently through the cottonwoods and Elliot's quiet patience. One tentative step, then another. The Colt descended the ramp, his thin legs trembling beneath his weight, but determination carrying him forward. Elliot stayed beside him, offering no rope, no push, only presence. The Colt's breathing eased when he reached level ground, and he leaned, just slightly, toward Elliot's shoulder, as though confirming again that this man was the safest space he'd found since whatever passed he couldn't forget. Elliot led him to the nearest paddock, opening the gate with a slow, metallic click. The sound made the Colt stiffen, ears snapping back, muscles tensing under his ashen coat. Elliot lifted a steady hand, not touching the animal, but creating a quiet boundary between fear and reaction. "Just a gate," he said softly. "Nothing more." The foal's breathing steadied. He stepped into the paddock, exploring the straw-covered ground with careful taps of his hooves. For the first time, Elliot saw the sun catch on his coat, a shimmering undertone, almost silver blue, like light reflecting off frost. A rare coloring, not something seen on local ranch stock. It made Elliot's brow tighten. Even for a foal in poor condition, there was something unusual, almost delicate, about him. Elliot rested his arms against the fence, watching as the Colt tested the space. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through Elliot's hair and the Colt's thin mane, carrying with it that same faint prickle of unease he'd felt back at the auction. He scanned the tree line automatically, years of instinct reminding him to trust the sensation. The cottonwoods swayed lazily, the path beyond remained empty. Still, the feeling lingered. He was reaching for the latch when a car door slammed behind him. Elliot turned sharply, heart jolting, but relaxed only marginally when he saw the familiar blue pickup rolling to a stop near the barn. It was Tom Drake, a neighbor he hadn't spoken to much since leaving the fire line, though Tom never failed to offer help when asked. Today, though, he arrived uninvited. Tom shoved his hands into his jacket pockets as he approached. "Heard you went to the auction this morning," he said, eyes drifting toward the paddock. "Didn't expect you to bring anything home." Elliot followed his gaze. The colt stood at the far end of the fence, watching Tom with wide, uneasy eyes. When the wind shifted just right, Elliot saw a faint ripple of tension run through the young animal. "Wasn't planning to," Elliot said. Tom raised a brow. "That scrawny thing. Monroe, you sure about this? Looks more like trouble than stock." Elliot didn't answer right away. He couldn't explain the instinct that had driven him to raise his hand. Couldn't explain why the colt's eyes felt like a mirror he wasn't ready to confront. Instead, he said, "He needed someone." Tom huffed. "Plenty of things need someone. Doesn't mean you can save 'em." Elliot's jaw tightened. The words weren't harsh, just practical, typical Wyoming logic shaped by long seasons and harder winters, but they hit something raw. Didn't ask for saving, just giving him a place to stand. Tom studied Elliot for a long moment, his expression softening with something close to concern. "Well, keep an eye out, all right?" "Had some strangers passing. Through earlier, asked around about that auction lot. Didn't look like ranch folks." That cold ripple returned to Elliot's spine. "What kind of strangers?" he asked. Tom shrugged. "Didn't say much, just showed a photo of some young horse. Color looked close to that one." He jerked his chin at the colt. "Figured it was none of my business." Elliot's breath grew shallow. The man in the dark coat had not been the only one. There were others. Tom clapped him on the shoulder once before heading back to his truck. "Take care, Monroe." When the pickup disappeared down the long road, Elliot returned to the paddock. The foal had edged closer, as though sensing the shift in the air. Elliot stood beside him, letting the wind press the silence into something steady. "Guess we're both in deeper than we meant to be," he murmured. The colt blinked, slow and trusting, and for the first time that day, Elliot wasn't sure who was comforting whom. The late afternoon sun cast long strips of amber across the paddock as Elliot returned from the barn with a bucket of clean water. Shadows stretched lazily over the ground, softening the rough edges of the old fence and giving the land a rare gentleness. Rowan stood near the corner, head lowered, his breath forming small clouds that dissolved quickly in the cooling air. The colt's thin frame looked even more fragile beneath the fading light, but there was something steadier about his stance now, as if the earth beneath Elliot's ranch carried a calmer rhythm than the noise of the auction barn. Elliot set the bucket down slowly, mindful not to let it clatter against the ground. The faintest hint of a metallic sound had startled the colt earlier, and Elliot wasn't eager to repeat that moment. Rowan looked up cautiously, ears flicking, then relaxed when he recognized the man's silhouette. That tiny shift, the way the colt's eyes softened, felt like a door opening inside Elliot's chest. He stepped inside the paddock, stopping far enough to give the colt space, but close enough for Rowan to choose. For a moment, neither moved. The breeze picked up, brushing a curtain of dust across the ground, and somewhere in the cottonwoods, a solitary crow called out. Elliot kept his movements slow. He'd learned long ago, while calming panicked wildfire survivors, that the body speaks a quiet language animals understand better than words. Steady breath, loose shoulders, no sudden edges. Rowan took a small step forward. It wasn't dramatic, just a hesitant lift of his hoof, a pause, then another step. But the simplicity of it pressed something warm against Elliot's ribs. Animals only approached when they sensed something familiar or something safe. Elliot wasn't sure which he offered, but the colt closed the distance between them until his muzzle hovered inches from Elliot's arm. "You're braver than you think," Elliot murmured. The colt's ears twitched as though considering the remark. His breath touched Elliot's sleeve, warm and unsure. Then, with a soft exhale, Rowan leaned his narrow head against Elliot's shoulder. The pressure was gentle, but intentional, a gesture that carried more trust than any rope or halter ever could. Elliot let his hand hover near the colt's neck before finally, slowly, resting it against the soft fur. Rowan didn't flinch. If anything, he pressed closer. It was the first moment all day that truly felt still. Elliot didn't know how long they stayed like that, listening to the wind settle around them, the sun lowering like a tired lantern behind the hills. But the peace held until Rowan's ears shot up sharply, muscles tightening beneath his pale coat. He lifted his head from Elliot's shoulder and stared toward the tree line with a sudden intensity. "What is it?" Elliot whispered, scanning the horizon. The cottonwoods rustled with a gust of wind that didn't feel quite natural, too quick, too concentrated. Elliot felt the familiar instinct stir in him again, the same one that had guided him through collapsed buildings and burning timber. Something wasn't right. He stepped forward, resting a calming hand near Rowan's neck. The colt trembled but didn't retreat, staying close as though drawing reassurance from Elliot's presence. Elliot narrowed his eyes, studying the shifting shadows beneath the trees, but nothing revealed itself. No vehicles, no silhouettes, no sound except the restless wind sweeping dry leaves in small spirals across the ground. Maybe Tom's warning earlier had slipped deeper into his nerves than he realized. Or maybe it wasn't nerves at all. Rowan shook his head sharply, mane fluttering like thin frost in the breeze. Elliot murmured a soft reassurance, and the colt's trembling eased. But he kept glancing toward the tree line, ears pinned forward, body half-turned like a compass needle seeking the direction of a storm. Elliot led him into the barn for the evening, deciding the colt had endured enough for his first day at the ranch. The barn, though old, carried the familiar scent of hay, soil, and pine, comforting to Elliot and perhaps to Rowan as well. The foal's hooves clicked softly against the wooden floor as he explored the stall, sniffing at the bucket of water and the thin flakes of hay Elliot had set out. The space felt safer, warmer, more sheltered from the unknown shadows outside. A soft lantern glow spilled across the colt's coat, revealing shades Elliot hadn't noticed before, hints of pale blue shimmering beneath the silver, as if the foal carried pieces of winter sky woven into his fur. Elliot found himself staring, surprised by the beauty of it. This was no ordinary coloring. Even in poor condition, Rowan looked rare, almost unreal. "You're something special, aren't you?" Elliot said quietly. Rowan lifted his head and met Elliot's eyes, not with fear this time, but with a question, as if wondering why this man spoke to him with tenderness when the rest of the world had turned away. Elliot leaned against the stall door, letting the long day settle into his bones. He hadn't planned for any of this. He hadn't planned to raise his hand at the auction. He hadn't planned to bring a fragile, trembling foal into his life. And he certainly hadn't planned to really feel, this strange sense of purpose returning like a slow, cautious flame. It was almost unsettling, and yet not unwelcome. The colt shifted again, brushing lightly against the stall wall, then stepped closer to Elliot one more time, lowering his head just enough for the man to understand. Elliot reached out, stroking the soft fur between the foal's ears with a gentleness he hadn't used in years. "You chose me," he whispered. Outside, the wind changed direction, carrying with it the faintest crunch of gravel, so distant and so soft that Elliot wasn't sure he'd heard it. Rowan's ears flicked, but he didn't panic. Not this time. He stayed close to the man who had offered him safety without condition. Elliot listened carefully, eyes lingering on the barn door. But the sound faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the lantern's quiet hum and the steady breaths of the foal who had chosen him for reasons neither of them could yet understand. The morning broke colder than the night before, the kind of cold that seeped quietly into the bones of the land and settled there. A thin strip of pale pink lined the horizon as Elliot guided Rowan from the barn into the frosty air. The colt hesitated at first, lifting each hoof with the delicate caution of an animal still learning where safety ended and uncertainty began. But unlike the day before, Rowan didn't cling to the shadows. He followed Elliot into the early light, ears forward, breath soft and white in the crisp dawn. Elliot stood for a moment, watching the colt adjust. Something about seeing him step into the open, no ceiling above him, no strangers pressing in, made Elliot feel strangely protective. Rowan was still thin, still trembling at sudden noises, but there was a new steadiness in him, a fragile courage building from the inside out. Elliot recognized it. He'd felt that same quiet bravery himself the first time he walked onto wildfire ground after the accident. Fear still lived in the body, but strength began in the decision to keep moving. He led Rowan toward the smaller paddock near the edge of his property. This part of the ranch overlooked a winding dirt road that split through a dense line of cottonwoods. Elliot liked that vantage point. It let him see who was coming long before they reached the gate. With Tom's warning still lingering in his mind, Elliot felt the need for that visibility more than ever. As Rowan stepped into the paddock, the new sounds of the open space caught his attention. The whistle of wind between fence posts, the distant hum of a truck somewhere beyond the hills, the faint rattle of loose grain inside the feeding trough. Each sound made the colt lift his head, ears twitching with a heightened sensitivity that bordered on extraordinary. It wasn't merely alertness. It was as though Rowan could feel sound, tracing it like a thread in the air. Elliot noticed it again and couldn't shake the sense that this colt had been conditioned somehow, trained or shaped in ways no ranch animal should be. He leaned against the paddock rail, studying Rowan. The colt moved with a soft tension, responding to the world with a precision Elliot had rarely seen in horses his age. Even in his weakened state, Rowan's instincts were sharp, too sharp. Elliot wasn't sure whether that realization unsettled him or deepened his desire to protect the animal. A faint rumble drifted from the road beyond the cottonwoods. Rowan froze, head lifting toward the sound. Elliot followed his gaze. The rumble grew louder, a steady mechanical pulse breaking the quiet of the morning. A truck, heavy, unfamiliar, rolled into view between the trees. Its windows were dark, its paint a muted charcoal that didn't reflect the weak sunrise. Elliot felt a chill slip beneath his coat. The truck slowed as it neared his property, not stopping, just slowing, as though assessing the land. The vehicle remained on the public road, tires humming low across the gravel, but its pace was too deliberate to be casual. Elliot watched every second of it, jaw tightening. Rowan pressed close to the far side of the paddock, muscles quivering, eyes locked on the vehicle with an intensity that bordered on fear. Then, as if sensing their watchfulness, the truck picked up speed again and disappeared down the bend, its rumble fading into the morning breeze. Elliot let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He hated coincidences. Life had taught him to distrust them. Between the man at the auction, Tom's warning yesterday, and now this silent observer cruising past his land, the unease that had been a whisper was turning into a clear voice. Something about Rowan wasn't merely unusual. Something about Rowan mattered to someone, and that was dangerous. Trying to anchor the moment back into normalcy, Elliot opened the paddock gate and stepped inside. Rowan approached him tentatively. Elliot reached out, brushing his hand along the colt's neck, feeling the tremor beneath the skin. "You're all right," he murmured. "They're gone." He didn't know if Rowan understood the words, but the tone seemed to matter. The colt steadied, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Elliot's sleeve. A gesture small, but filled with trust. Elliot let his hand rest gently against the colt's cheek, grounding both of them. "You're safe here," he whispered, though a part of him wondered if it was true. He spent the next hour tending to the ranch, checking water lines, stacking feed, repairing a loose hinge on the barn door. Rowan followed his movements from the town, Paddock occasionally lifting his head when a distant noise caught his attention. It was a constant reminder that the world beyond the ranch wasn't as quiet as it seemed. Elliot had lived with risk for years on the fire line, danger that roared and cracked like thunder. This was different, a quieter kind of threat, one that moved invisibly and left no scent of smoke. As the sun climbed higher, Elliot returned to the paddock with a brush in hand. Rowan flinched at first sight of it, another sign that the colt had known harsher hands at some point, but Elliot held it still, letting Rowan approach in his own time. After a long moment, the colt stepped forward and touched the brush with his nose. Elliot began brushing him slowly, working through the matted patches of his pale coat. With each stroke, Rowan grew calmer. The tension around his eyes softened. His breathing steadied. The silver-blue sheen of his fur emerged beneath the dirt and neglect, revealing a beauty Elliot hadn't realized was hidden there. It felt like uncovering the truth of the animal, something delicate, something valuable, something misunderstood. "That's it," Elliot said quietly, a smile ghosting across his face. "You're doing good." Rowan let out a soft exhale, leaning subtly into the brush. It was the closest thing to comfort Elliot had seen from him yet. The moment was peaceful, steady, unbroken, until a sudden metallic click echoed from the direction of the cottonwoods. Rowan jolted, body going rigid. Elliot spun toward the sound, heart hammering. But the trees stood motionless, their branches swaying in the cold breeze as though mocking the tension that tightened in Elliot's chest. Nothing. No movement, no figure, just the whisper of leaves and the emptiness between them. But Elliot knew what he'd heard, and Rowan's reaction confirmed it wasn't his imagination. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Elliot placed a steady hand on the colt's neck, though his own pulse hadn't yet settled. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you inside." As he led Rowan back toward the barn, his gaze swept the edge of the trees one more time. He saw nothing, but he no longer believed nothing was there. The barn door creaked softly behind Elliot as he guided Rowan into the warmth. Afternoon light filtered through the high windows, casting gentle stripes across the straw-covered floor. The colt moved slowly, still unsettled from the mysterious sound near the cottonwoods, his ears twitching at even the faintest shift in the rafters. Elliot kept a steady pace beside him, offering quiet reassurance in the calm language horses understood best. Presence over pressure. Rowan drifted toward the far stall as though drawn to its dimmer, safer shadows. Elliot closed the half-door behind him and leaned his arms across the top, letting the colt settle. Outside, the wind swept across the ranch in long, restless strokes, carrying the bite of oncoming winter. Inside the barn, breath and silence mingled like dust suspended in the fading light. Elliot watched Rowan carefully. Every movement felt intentional, delicate. The colt lifted his head at a faint drip from the water line, then turned sharply at the flutter of a tarp near the haystack. His reactions were sharper than simple skittishness. They were precise, hyper-aware. Elliot knew frightened animals. He'd rescued enough during wildfire seasons, horses, dogs, sometimes even deer sprinting through flames, to recognize the difference between fear and conditioning. Rowan didn't simply react to sounds, he tracked them. "You're listening for something," Elliot murmured, more to himself than the colt. Rowan's ears angled toward him, then back to the wall, as though weighing the safety of the present against memories Elliot could not see. Determined to examine him properly, Elliot slipped into the stall. Rowan shifted but didn't retreat. That trust, new, wobbly, yet persistent, pressed something warm against Elliot's ribs. He raised a gentle hand and touched the colt's shoulder. Beneath the thin coat, his skin quivered like a sensitive instrument tuned too tightly. "Let's see," Elliot whispered. He traced the fur along Rowan's spine, then down toward the shoulder joint. His fingers paused. There, beneath the coat, lay a faint series of ridged impressions, barely visible in the lantern light, but unmistakable beneath his touch. They weren't from ropes or halters used on ranch stock. The pattern was too straight, too uniform, like something fitted around the young animal with purpose rather than accident. A frown settled onto Elliot's face. He pressed more gently and felt a subtle bump under the skin, no larger than a grain of corn, firm but not natural. Rowan flinched. "It's all right," Elliot said softly, stepping back to give him space. The colt exhaled sharply, but his trembling eased. Elliot leaned against the stall door, thoughts tightening like cinched rope. He didn't have the expertise to interpret what he'd found, but someone would. Someone he trusted. He reached for his phone and called the one person who'd always shown up during both the hard years and the quiet ones. Nora Beckett, the closest veterinarian in Cedar Brook. She'd known Elliot since before the Fireline days, before tragedy carved its mark into him. Nora answered on the second ring. "Monroe? Everything all right?" "Not sure," Elliot said. He glanced at Rowan. "Could use your eyes on a horse I brought home, that the Colt folks were whispering about at the diner?" she asked. Elliot stiffened. "Already reached the diner?" "Small town," Nora said dryly. "News outruns gossip, and gossip outruns sunrise. I'll be there in 20. True to her word, Nora's truck rumbled up the drive while the sun still clung stubbornly to the hills. She stepped out in her usual dark vest and braided gray-streaked hair, eyes sharp enough to cut through fog. She greeted Elliot with a nod, then turned toward the barn. "Let's see what you dragged home," she said. Rowan lifted his head the moment Nora approached, nostrils flaring as he read her scent, her posture, the rhythm of her boots. Elliot watched closely, but the colt didn't panic, just studied. Alert but curious. Nora stepped into the stall slowly, crouching with a fluidity born from years of working with animals who didn't trust easily. "Hey there," she murmured. "You're a pretty one, aren't you?" Rowan blinked. Elliot couldn't tell if it was agreement or uncertainty. Nora examined him inch by inch, her brow tightening almost immediately. "He's severely underweight," she said, "malnourished, but that isn't what concerns me." She ran her fingers along Rowan's shoulder and froze. Her hand hovered over the small raised bump beneath the skin. "Elliot," she said quietly, "this isn't normal." Elliot's stomach tightened. "I found it earlier." Nora looked up at him, her expression shifting from curiosity to something more sober. "Have you seen anything like this before?" "Not on a horse," Elliot said. Nora nodded once, then continued her exam. She tapped lightly near Rowan's flank. The colt's reaction was swift, ears snapping forward, muscles pocketing with tension. But it wasn't fear. It was focus, as though he were locating the source of the sound. "That's not typical prey behavior," Nora said. "That's response training." Elliot felt the cold inside him grow sharper. "You think somebody trained him?" Nora stood slowly. "Not in any way I've seen on working ranches. This is specialized, maybe military, maybe rescue operations." She hesitated before adding, "Or something more classified." Wind rattled the barn doors, and Rowan flinched. Without thinking, Elliot stepped forward, placing himself between the colt and the noise. Rowan steadied almost instantly, breathing easier with Elliot near. Nora watched the exchange with raised eyebrows. "He's bonded to you quickly," she said. "Too quickly for a horse this traumatized." Elliot didn't respond. He didn't know how. Nora stepped out of the stall, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Listen," she said, her voice low. "Whatever his past is, someone put a lot of time into shaping him. Animals don't get this sensitive unless they've been conditioned for something specific." Elliot felt a familiar heaviness settle over him, the same weight he'd felt standing outside a burning building years ago, knowing he was about to step into a situation he couldn't fully understand. "What do you think happens next?" he asked. Nora's eyes drifted toward the fading light outside the barn door. "I think someone's going to come looking for him," she said, "and when they do, it won't be because they miss him." The barn fell silent. Rowan leaned forward, brushing his muzzle against Elliot's shoulder as though searching for comfort. Elliot rested a steady hand against the colt's neck. His voice, a whisper, meant more for himself than the animal beside him. "Who were you before this?" Rowan didn't answer, but the question hung in the air between them, heavy, urgent, and filled with the weight of a past neither of them understood. Night settled over Cedar Brook in a slow, deliberate hush, the kind of hush that made every creak of wood and brush of wind feel sharper, as though the darkness itself had learned to listen. Elliot stepped out of the barn after settling Rowan in his stall, pulling his jacket tighter as a cold breath rolled down from the mountains. The moon carved a pale arc through the clouds, illuminating the ranch in muted silver. It should have been peaceful, but peace felt like a visitor who had lost his way. Rowan had been restless all evening, shifting his weight from one trembling leg to the other, eyes darting anywhere the shadows thickened. Elliot tried to chalk it up to the colt's past, whatever shape that past had taken. But even that explanation felt too small. There was a difference between an animal haunted by memory and an animal sensing something moving in the present. Elliot locked the barn door, though he knew a latch meant little against a determined person. He took a final look across the open yard before heading back to the house. The dirt path, the line of cottonwoods, the edge of his property, they all lay quiet, still, empty. He wasn't halfway to the porch when Rowan's shrill, panicked cry split the air. Elliot spun around. The barn lantern flickered violently inside, its light casting huge, trembling shadows along the wooden walls. Rowan was slamming his body against the stall door, hooves striking the planks with desperate force. Elliot sprinted back, heart pounding. The colt wasn't just afraid. He was warning, reacting, pleading, all at once. "Easy, easy," Elliot shouted as he rushed in. But Rowan didn't calm. His eyes were fixed beyond Elliot, past the barn entrance, toward a darkness that seemed to pulse with something unseen. Elliot froze. A soft crunch echoed outside, slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. Someone approaching with purpose. He stepped toward the barn door, instincts sharpened by years on the fire line, where danger rarely showed itself fully, only hinted through smoke and vibration. "Who's there?" he called out, steady but firm. Silence answered him. Silence. And then another crunch of gravel. Rowan slammed against the stall again, trying to reach Elliot, panic radiating through every line of his thin body. Elliot didn't wait. He reached for the old rake leaning against the wall, hardly a weapon, but better than nothing, and positioned himself just inside the doorway. His pulse thundered in his ears. Every second stretched taut, as though the night were pulling itself thin around him. "Come out where I can see you," he said, louder now. This time the darkness responded. A shape separated from the deeper shadows under the cottonwoods. At first it was only movement, the faint distortion of light against dark fabric. Then a man stepped forward, slow and calm, as if he'd been waiting for Elliot to notice him. Elliot held the rake tighter. "State your business." The man stopped just outside the lantern's reach. His coat was the same dark fabric Elliot had seen at the auction, its hem brushing the tops of well-worn boots. Even in the dim light, Elliot could sense the man's composure, controlled, unbothered, like someone accustomed to stepping into barns at night without fear. "I'm not here to harm you," the man said, voice low, "or the horse." "Then why come sneaking onto my land after dark?" Elliot shot back. The stranger took one step closer, enough for the moonlight to reveal the stubble on his jaw and the sharp focus in his eyes. He raised his hand slightly, not surrender, but a calculated signal. "Because daylight doesn't afford the kind of conversation we need to have." Rowan cried out again, a sound halfway between terror and fury. Elliot shifted his position, blocking the view to the stall instinctively. The man's gaze flicked toward the noise. "He remembers," he murmured. "More than you know." "Who are you?" Elliot asked. The man stayed silent long enough for the question to cling to the cold air. Then he said, "Someone who's been trying to find that foal for months." Elliot felt his grip tighten, knuckles whitening around the rake. "You part of whatever program did that to him?" A flicker of something, guilt, frustration, crossed the man's expression before he masked it. "I was associated with it. Not anymore." "That's not good enough." The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "My name's Silas Hart, and whether you believe me or not, you're in possession of an animal that was never meant to show up at an auction barn, not after what happened." Elliot frowned. "What happened?" Silas stepped closer. The lantern light caught his eyes fully now, sharp, assessing, but carrying a weight Elliot recognized, the weight of someone who'd seen something go terribly wrong. "There was a fire," Silas said, "a facility up in Montana. The horses inside were part of a sensory response program, designed to detect sound frequencies and locate survivors in disaster zones. The foal you call Rowan was born there." Rowan reacted instantly, letting out a distressed whine low in his throat. Elliot felt his heart twist. The colt's fear wasn't abstract. It was memory. Silas continued, voice quieter. "When the fire broke out, the handlers evacuated what they could, but files were lost, animals were lost. Some turned up dead, some vanished." His gaze sharpened. Rowan was one of the vanished. Elliot swallowed. "And now you're here to take him?" Silas shook his head. "If I were here to take him, you wouldn't have seen me at all." The words hit Elliot with a strange mixture of comfort and dread. Silas stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "There are others interested in finding that foal. People who don't care about his well-being or yours. People with authority and without patience." The barn seemed to shrink around them, the walls absorbing the gravity of every word. Elliot stepped protectively toward Rowan. "He's not going anywhere." Silas studied him carefully, then glanced at the colt, trembling, watching, remembering. "Then you need to understand what you're choosing." For a moment, neither man moved. The wind pushed against the barn, rattling the roof in a way that made Rowan jump. Elliot reached a calming hand toward the colt, feeling the tremor beneath his skin. Silas exhaled slowly. "If they find him here, it won't end well. Not for either of you." "Then help me understand what they want," Elliot said. Silas hesitated, truly hesitated, before answering. "They want the research back. They want the asset back. And they're not bound by the same line I crossed when I walked away." Outside, the gravel shifted faintly again, so faint Elliot wasn't sure if it was real or his imagination. Rowan jerked his head toward the sound, muscles tightening. Silas's eyes narrowed. "They're closer than I thought." Elliot stepped between the colt and the door, instinct overriding fear. Silas held up a hand. "I can't stay. If they find me here, they'll assume you already know too much." "Don't leave us with nothing," Elliot said. "Tell me what I need to do." Silas's expression softened, not with kindness, but with a reluctant respect. "Then listen carefully," he said, "because the next steps you take will decide whether that foal survives the week." And with that, the night seemed to lean in, waiting for an answer neither man had yet spoken aloud. Silas's warning hung in the air long after the sound of his footsteps faded into the night. Elliot stood in the barn doorway, staring into the darkness he could no longer pretend was empty. The cold pressed against his skin, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, a slow, rising dread that settled into the space behind his ribs. Rowan stood trembling behind him, the colt's breath jagged and uneven, each exhale a reminder that fear had become something living inside him. Elliot closed the barn door with deliberate care. The latch clicked softly, but Rowan jerked anyway, muscles rippling beneath his pale coat. "It's all right," Elliot whispered, though the words felt thin. Rowan stepped closer until his muzzle brushed Elliot's forearm, seeking reassurance with a desperation that tightened Elliot's throat. Trust was not something won easily from a wounded animal. Rowan entrusted himself to whoever made him feel safest. And right now, that someone was Elliot. Elliot lit the lantern again, flooding the barn with warm amber light that pushed back the darkest corners. Rowan blinked, his breathing slowing slightly as the familiar glow softened the harsh edges of the night. Elliot guided him back into the stall, not shutting the door fully this time. He wanted the colt to know he wasn't being trapped, just protected. Silas's words replayed in his mind like echoes from a canyon wall. There was a fire, a program, a facility where horses were trained not to run from danger but toward it, designed to hear what humans couldn't, to find what others had lost, to detect survivors in collapsing buildings, in smoke-filled ruins, beneath rubble. Elliot felt his breath catch. He had spent nearly half his life trying to save lives in burning structures. Knowing this colt had been bred for the same purpose, trained for the very world he had walked away from, hit him with a force he wasn't ready for. "You were made to do the job I couldn't finish," he murmured. Rowan lifted his head as if he sensed the change in Elliot's voice. "Someone shaped you for danger," Elliot continued softly, "and then danger took everything from you." The colt blinked slowly, leaning his weight against the railing. His vulnerability stirred something old in Elliot, an instinct buried in ash and smoke, a part of him he'd believed the wildfire had burned away forever. He poured a small scoop of grain into a shallow bucket. Rowan nudged it cautiously, then began to eat in small, careful bites. It was the first time since arriving at the ranch that he'd eaten without trembling. Elliot watched, feeling a tentative hope rise inside him. Progress, no matter how fragile, mattered. A gust of wind rattled the barn roof, sending Rowan's ears flicking upright. Elliot moved closer, resting a calming hand near the colt's cheek. Rowan steadied almost immediately. The bond was forming faster and stronger than Elliot expected, a connection woven through fear, recognition, and something neither of them had words for. Suddenly, a soft glow rippled across the barn wall. Headlights. Elliot stiffened. A vehicle moved slowly along the distant road, its beams cutting across the field like searching eyes. He didn't breathe until the lights drifted past the property and disappeared behind the hill. But a chill remained, crawling beneath the surface of his skin. Whoever they were searching. And Silas had been right. They were getting closer. Rowan let out a quiet, trembling sound. Elliot stepped back into the stall, kneeling in front of him. "I'm not letting anyone take you," he said firmly. "Not after what you've been through. Not after everything you've shown me." The colt exhaled through his nose, warm breath brushing Elliot's hand. "Maybe they see you as an asset," Elliot said. "But I see you, the real you." The barn settled into a heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic tap of Rowan's hooves shifting through the straw. Elliot rose to his feet, then turned as the side door creaked open behind him. Nora stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the moonlit yard. She carried a small case and wore an expression that told Elliot she hadn't driven over this late for nothing. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "Thought I'd check on him and on you." Elliot nodded, but his eyes searched her face. "You know something else." Nora exhaled. Silas Hart used to work with the federal disaster response teams. He wasn't just some researcher. He oversaw animal integration programs across multiple states. She paused, watching Elliot closely. "And the project Rowan came from? It wasn't just shut down. It was erased." Elliot felt the words settle heavily in his bones. "Why erased?" "Because the public wasn't supposed to know they were engineering animals to anticipate and respond to disaster zones," Nora said. "It crossed too many ethical lines." Elliot looked at the colt, who had gone still as though absorbing every sound. "He's not a weapon." "No," Nora said softly, "but to the wrong people, he's proof. Proof of what they created. Proof of what they lost." Elliot felt his jaw clench. "And they want him back." Nora nodded slowly. "I'd bet everything on it." The barn felt smaller suddenly, the lantern light weaker, the air too still. Elliot moved to the window and peered out across the yard. The night had grown thick and silent, the kind of silence that made every instinct feel sharpened. Nora stepped beside him. "Elliot, you may need to consider moving him." "I'm not running," Elliot said. "Running isn't the same as protecting," Nora whispered. Rowan lifted his head again, watching them both with those silvery, haunted eyes. Elliot turned toward him, the decision forming like stone inside his chest. He's survived fire, fear. Whoever trained him, whoever lost him. Elliot's voice steady, quiet, resolute. He won't face the rest alone. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows along the barn walls. Outside, the night deepened, heavy with unseen footsteps and unspoken intentions. Elliot had no answers yet, only a truth that had surfaced fully now, undeniable as the rising dawn. Rowan wasn't in his life by accident, and protecting him wasn't a burden. It was the first purpose Elliot Monroe had felt in years. The wind picked up after midnight, sweeping across the ranch like a restless spirit. Elliot had given up on sleep altogether. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, gone cold hours earlier, staring through the window toward the dark outline of the barn. Each time the wind rattled the loose tin panel on the roof, his pulse jumped. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but the night carried a tension that refused to fade. Rowan's presence in the barn felt like a glowing ember, fragile, precious, and dangerously visible in a world too eager to stamp it out. Silas's warning reverberated through Elliot's mind with unwelcome persistence. Others will come, others who don't care about you. Or the horse. Elliot had seen enough bureaucratic indifference during wildfire deployments to know that some missions moved forward without regard for the lives caught in their wake. When the ranch dog barked suddenly, a deep, sharp alarm that cut through the night, Elliot was on his feet before the chair finished scraping the floor. He grabbed his jacket from the hook and stepped outside. The cold bit through the fabric, but he barely felt it. His breath rose in white bursts as he crossed the yard, boots crunching over patches of frost. The dog stood rigid near the gate, fur bristled, growling low into the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. Elliot narrowed his eyes, adjusting to the dim moonlight. At first, all he saw were shifting branches. Then, through the tangle of shadows, a faint red glow flickered, like a dying ember caught between trees. Elliot's chest tightened. Headlights. Not approaching, not driving past. Waiting. The glow blinked once, then vanished, swallowed by the tree line. No engine hummed, no door opened, no gravel shifted. Whoever sat out there was choosing to remain unseen, and the deliberate stillness was somehow more threatening than any obvious intrusion. Rowan let out a high, trembling cry from the barn, confirming the danger before Elliot could convince himself otherwise. He moved quickly, shutting the gate and double-checking the lock before heading toward the barn. Inside, the lantern still glowed faintly where he had left it earlier. Rowan was pressed against the stall door, eyes wide, breath quivering. The moment he saw Elliot, the colt stepped forward as if trying to climb through the wooden slats to reach him. "Easy, boy," Elliot whispered, rubbing his palm gently near Rowan's cheek. "I'm here." Rowan's muscles loosened, but the terror in his gaze didn't fade entirely. Elliot knew that look. He'd worn it himself after the wildfire had taken his team. It was the look of someone who had learned to recognize danger before it spoke. Elliot glanced back at the barn entrance, uneasy. The wind moved through the rafters in a hollow moan, but beneath it he sensed something else. An absence, a silence too thick, too intentional. It was the kind of silence found at the edge of a fire zone, when the air seemed to hold its breath before the flames revealed themselves. Nora arrived just before dawn. Her truck lights swept through the barn windows in a brief arc of illumination. She stepped inside with her medical kit in hand, but the moment she saw Elliot's face, she stopped short. What happened? "They're out there," Elliot said quietly. "I saw headlights in the trees. Someone watching." Nora closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. "You need to take this seriously. If they located him here—" "They haven't stepped onto the property," Elliot cut in. "Not yet." "That's not reassuring," Nora replied sharply. "It means they're gauging your habits, your movements, waiting for an opening." Rowan whinnied softly, nudging Elliot's shoulder. Nora observed the colt, her expression softening. "He knows they're close," she murmured. "Animals sense intention long before we do." Elliot leaned against the stall, his voice low. "Silas said Rowan remembers, that he was trained to identify frequencies humans can't hear." Nora nodded. "Which means he may sense whoever's out there in ways we can't." The realization pressed a cold weight onto Elliot's chest. Rowan wasn't just afraid of the present. He was reacting to the echoes of a past being dragged toward him again. Nora set her medical kit on a bale of hay and gently examined the colt. Rowan stiffened only slightly this time, trusting her hands. "His vitals are stabilizing," she said, "but his anxiety spikes with certain sounds, like he's anticipating something." Elliot didn't need her to explain. Rowan had been bred to react to signals, subtle acoustic cues designed for search and rescue operations. If someone nearby was using equipment or surveillance tools, Rowan would sense them long before Elliot could. A soft metallic click sounded outside. Rowan shot upright, pupils blowing wide. Elliot turned toward the barn door, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" Nora nodded, tightening her grip on her flashlight. That wasn't the wind. Footsteps moved outside, soft, measured, controlled. Not the hurried steps of someone fleeing, but the patient tread of someone surveying, inspecting, evaluating. Elliot motioned for Nora to stay behind him as he approached the door. He pushed it open slowly. The yard lay empty, touched only by the muted wash of dawn beginning to bleed across the sky. Frost sparkled in the early light, undisturbed. There were no footprints, no vehicles, no sign of a visitor. But on the wooden railing near the barn entrance, Elliot saw it, a fresh scuff mark, faint but clear from a boot that hadn't been there earlier. A silent message, a presence confirmed, a boundary tested. Nora exhaled shakily. They were right here. Elliot stared at the mark for a long moment. He knew how to read signs left behind after a crisis. Shifts in ash, disturbed debris, the soot pattern across burned walls. This mark wasn't accidental. Someone had stood close enough to touch the barn, close enough to hear Rowan's cries. "We're running out of time," Nora whispered. Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he walked back into the barn and rested his hand on Rowan's neck. The colt leaned into the touch with a soft, exhausted shiver. "They want him back," Elliot said quietly. "But they'll have to go through me first." Rowan lowered his head beside Elliot's shoulder. It wasn't fear this time. It was agreement. Dawn rose slowly, pushing a muted gold across the Wyoming fields. It was the kind of dawn that felt hesitant, as though the sky itself wasn't sure if it should reveal the day or hold on to the safety of night a little longer. Elliot hadn't slept. He'd spent the last hours pacing between the barn and the house, checking the windows, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Rowan, too, had barely rested, his head lifting at the slightest creak, the tremor in his legs returning with each gust of uncertain wind. When the first full rays of sunlight touched the barn roof, Elliot stepped inside the stall. Rowan's ears perked at the familiar sound of his boots, and his breathing steadied as Elliot approached. The colt pressed his forehead gently against Elliot's arm, the gesture no longer rooted in fear, but in something far deeper, a bond woven through shared survival. Elliot ran a hand down Rowan's neck. "Morning," he whispered, voice rough from the long night. "Seems we made it through." Rowan exhaled softly, as though agreeing, but the relief was short-lived. Footprints still marred the dirt near the barn door. Tire marks lingered at the edge of the property. The silence outside had grown too heavy, almost expectant. Whoever had been watching wasn't done. Elliot felt it in the way Rowan tensed when the breeze shifted, in the way the ranch dog refused to leave the porch. Tail lowered but alert. Nora arrived again just after sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and exhaustion etched deep into her eyes. "I stayed up listening to the scanner," she said as Elliot met her in the yard. There were unmarked vehicles moving near the old access roads. No patrols were notified. "That tells me everything I need to know." Elliot nodded. He had suspected as much. "They're circling." "They're preparing," Nora corrected, "and they won't wait much longer." He glanced toward the barn where Rowan watched from the open stall door. His silver-blue coat caught the morning light, glowing faintly. Too unique, too recognizable. If the wrong people saw him now, there would be no doubt. Rowan wasn't just a missing animal. He was a loose end. Nora placed a hand on Elliot's arm. "You need to think about leaving." Elliot's jaw tightened. "This is my home. And I know what it cost you to build a place that felt safe," she said gently. "But safety isn't the same as staying still. If you stay here, they will corner you. You'll have no leverage, no options." Elliot looked back at Rowan, fragile, trembling, extraordinary. The foal had endured more than he could articulate, carrying memories of fire and confinement inside bones that should have known only open fields. Elliot saw too much of himself in that kind of survival. He knew what it meant to escape something devastating, only to fear the world would drag you back into the flames. He stepped into the stall again. Rowan lifted his head and took a step closer, seeking Elliot's steadying presence. Elliot rested his forehead against the colt's, an unspoken promise passing between them. "It's not running," Elliot murmured. "It's choosing the road." Rowan's breath warmed his skin. Aurora watched from the doorway, her expression softening. "If you leave within the hour, you'll have a window. The roads toward the foothills won't be monitored yet. You can get ahead of them." "Where would I go?" Elliot asked. "Somewhere they're not expecting," Nora replied. "Somewhere Rowan can breathe without listening for danger every second." Elliot knew she was right. He felt it in the lingering tension in his shoulders, in the way Rowan startled at distant sounds that didn't disturb other animals. Staying wasn't loyalty. It was risking a life that was finally beginning to heal. He packed quickly: feed, blankets, a few tools, a map, and the old canteen he used on wildfire deployments. The truck groaned when he opened the door, reminding him of all the miles it had carried him through, all the storms, the chaos, the grief. Now it would carry him towards something else, something unplanned but necessary. When he returned to the barn for Rowan, Nora stood waiting with the halter in hand. "He trusts you more than anyone," she said softly. "Let him walk beside you. Don't force him." Elliot nodded. He opened the stall, and Rowan stepped forward without hesitation. His legs were still shaky, but his resolve had changed. The colt no longer looked like a creature waiting to be claimed. He looked like one choosing to be led by someone he already belonged to. Together they moved toward the trailer. Rowan hesitated at the ramp, ears flicking as he listened, not to metal, but to the world beyond the barn. Elliot stepped inside first, turning to face him with calm, steady breath. "It's just another step," he said. "We'll take it together." Rowan lifted his hoof. Another step, then another. And then he was inside, taller somehow, as though choosing this path had straightened something in him that fear had bent. Elliot secured the latch, checked it twice, then stepped back to meet Nora's eyes. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head. "Just promise me you'll come back when it's safe." He didn't promise. He couldn't. The road ahead was unknown, shifting beneath the weight of decisions made under starlight. But he nodded, and Nora accepted that as the closest thing to certainty he could offer. Elliot climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled awake, echoing across the frost-touched yard. As he pulled toward the gate, Rowan shifted inside the trailer, steadying himself as if bracing for the unknown. Elliot glanced into the side mirror. Their eyes met through the slats. For the first time since the auction, Rowan didn't look afraid. He looked ready. Elliot opened. The gate drove past the cottonwoods and turned onto the narrow dirt road that stretched toward the foothills. The ranch disappeared behind them slowly, swallowed by dawn's growing light. They didn't know where the road led, but they knew they would walk it together. And for Elliot Monroe, for the first time in years, that was enough. If this story touched you the way it touched us while telling it, share your thoughts below. Even a simple comment helps this channel reach more people who love heartfelt stories like this. And if you'd like to join us for the next journey, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the stories waiting just ahead.